Hi, welcome to this session, and we'll focus on methodology and basically research designs, approaches, and sampling. So we intend to highlight the different research designs, explore methodological approaches that would be quantitative, qualitative, and all mixed methods approach, and then we'll discuss sampling techniques that respectively um, relate to the designs and most especially the approaches. So, to begin with, what is a research design? Um, this is, of course, the overall framework that defines your research, and by framework, we mean the strategy or any logical plan that you have set in terms of methods, procedures, analysis, how you want to report your findings, and everything. So all that logic plan um, defines what a research design is for your study. And of course, the research design is influenced by the research paradigms. And we recently talked about the research paradigm, which involves three main aspects: ontology, which means what is reality, and epistemology, how do we know reality is there, or and then methodology, how do we get to find out that reality really exists. So the research design rotates around a paradigm that you want to look at. So for instance, if you really want to do um, if you want to do an objective study which is correlational, and that wants to talk about to verify relationship between variables, yeah, then you're bound to go for a correlational study design. There are many ways of classifying designs, but the most commonly designs are classified based on the methodological approaches, which includes um, quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods approaches. So here would dig deep into methodological approaches, and we look at the nature, the strength, and weaknesses of each. So let's begin with quantitative. This is objective, and it focuses on what people do, uh, and at the end of the study, you would want to generalize your findings based on what you have established, and these findings, of course, will be representing the larger samples. Okay, so quantitative usually uh, uh, is done with the aim of generalizing the findings um, from that are drawn from within your samples. Okay, so the representation is very important. Of course, in it is manipulative, that you get to, for instance, do econometrics or modeling to achieve your objective and to answer the question that you have. And usually, the nature of findings or communication or reporting is statistics, and deals with the numerical data, and this can be presented in form of analyzed and presented in form of data tables, frequencies that is descriptive, or you or go ahead and look at regulation, and you present data in form of statistics that you want to communicate through what, for instance, p-values and so on. The limitation with this is that it lacks details, so it only talks about how, what, when, and where, but it does not talk about why. Okay, so it's deductive in nature, and therefore it limits details. So it focuses on reducing information into certain numbers that will then communicate your message. On the other hand, qualitative is subjective. It focuses on understanding people's meanings. For instance, not only just on what, but also on why. So focusing on reasons why certain events or certain phenomenon are happening. And the strength is that it provides details of why things are happening, and it generates of course new insights into the issue that is under study. What the weakness is that it deals with small samples, but of course with lots of data, and therefore that means it makes it hard to analyze. Even if you want to use software to analyze, just the way you use software such as SPS or SPSS or Stata in quantitative. Even in qualitative, you may use software, but still the researcher or the analyst has to do lots of work while analyzing, and therefore makes it time consuming. Uh, the other one is a combination of both qualitative and quantitative, which is commonly referred to as mixed methods approach. And uh, you mix both in a single study, and the advantage is that you can use one method or information from one method, one approach, and to confirm or verify or reject results from the other. You can use also that information to expand on on information from the other approach, or develop into new insights, or even complement or explain or update and clarify um, information that is generated from the other approach. Of course, we are later on going to dig deep into these um, when we get to designs. So one weakness with mixed method is that it becomes more complex. Therefore, you need more expertise, and you need more extra. You need extra resources in terms of time and money. So let's dig deep into quantitative designs, and one of them is descriptive design. And when you're using descriptive design, you're only focusing on generating data that describes the situation or issue or a case or event or phenomenon, and only focusing on describing the characteristics of what happens or frequencies of how things happen or when, and other categories of descriptions. But it does not explain why. So therefore, no details. Correlational test relationships. The relationships can be negative or positive um, between variables. Okay, but not that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. So, for instance, one may need to check whether, for instance, increase in income in a household would lead to or has any influence on education achievement within that household, or whether increase in income would relates to buying a car in a certain household. Okay, yeah, but it does not necessarily mean that when you test those relationship, doesn't necessarily mean that Whether income, if income relates to buying a car, does not necessarily mean that income causes one to buy a car. Okay, that's what we mean by correlation is not causation. Then we have experimental or quasi-experimental. I am joining them here because they both test cause and effect relationship to determine the probability of causality. But of course, the difference between uh, experimental and quasi-experimental is that the groups that we use to test the probability of causality are different. So under experiment, we use both treatment and control groups, which means that in pure experiments, we control other factors so that we can attribute the findings or the causality to specific variables. And then, take an example, you want to test whether cash transfers directly cause improvement in well-being in certain household. Then you control, for instance, for some groups, and then and the treatment group. And then the quasi-experimental, you have treatment and comparison. So in here, you do not hide control the groups, but you'll find similar groups that are related, and then you use one for treatment and the other one for comparison to see whether there is change after intervention. Okay, so these are quantitative design. For qualitative designs, we have ethnographic, which is in-depth study of culture of groups, organization within their natural settings. So you get in and use particular methods, such as, for instance, observation and so on, to study how certain people behave within certain settings. Okay. Then you have case study, which is an intensive analysis of a single case, also usually referred to as unit of analysis, or you can have multiple cases for comparison. So you could compare persons, you could compare households, you could compare organizations or interventions that are similar or that are related, um, to see, to deeply understand how things are happening and why they are happening. Okay, so the main question, of course, would be also why, because case study is mostly commonly used in cases where you are exploring a new phenomenon that has not been highly studied. You have also grounded theory, which focuses on discovering existing problems and how people deal with such problems. And therefore, in this case, you can formulate, test, and refine hypotheses to develop new theory, which is referred to as the grounded theory. You also have phenomenological designs, which focus on testing, on understanding the lived experiences of person, after, for instance, after experiencing a certain phenomenon. For instance, one could say, okay, I want to understand the lived experiences of immigrants from Ukraine to from Ukraine, refugees that have migrated to Europe, considering that, for instance, this is a new case that has not happened before for some time, or considering after World War II. So this could be a new thing that you want to to understand. There is also narrative, which usually uses stories. For instance, it could be life stories, um, to understand how people perceive or experience certain phenomenon. So, for instance, you could have an intervention, let's say a new teaching method that has not been experienced in a certain school, and then you want to engage teachers or pupils, to understand their perceptions or their experiences with the new teaching method. You could have also additional designs which specifically use secondary data. Of course, it does not mean that those that we have identified above do not also rely on secondary data, but these ones purely rely on secondary data. So you have reviews, which include systematic designs or scoping reviews or synthesis and other types of reviews, which rely on gathering empirical evidence and using that evidence to define and the problem or the questions, and then you use systematic techniques or methods or procedures to analyze and interpret that evidence from those empirical studies. One could also do use meta-analytic design, whereby statistical procedures are applied to analyze and combine results from several studies. So, for instance, one could use meta-analysis to study evaluation studies that have been done on certain interventions, and then you can test, for instance, methodology, how the different methods were used, and whether they are able to provide similar results within similar contexts. Okay. Then you have mixed methods designs, and you could have convergent or parallel design, whereby one can do quantitative data collection analysis, then at the same time does qualitative data collection and analysis, and then this is followed up with interpretation of findings from both. Okay. There is explanatory sequential design, where one does, or the researcher does quantitative data collection and analysis, and then this is followed up with qualitative data collection and analysis. So in the first instance, one wants to, for instance, provide descriptive study, descriptive data such as trends and other categories, and then considering that in quant you do not explain in terms, provide details, then you follow up with qualitative to explain why, and then you can interpret. Then exploratory sequential, you begin with qualitative collection of data and analysis, and then that can build onto quantitative collection of data. So for instance, you could use a case study design you could use a case study design that is which is qualitative, to understand why people behave in a certain way within certain conditions. And then after that, you want to generalize to a larger population, then you use a questionnaire or survey on a larger population to confirm or verify such findings within a larger population, and then you can interpret. Or another one can use embedded, whereby you have a dominant quantitative or qualitative data collection analysis, and then within that dominant you have less qualitative or quantitative, depending on what you have started with in the dominant study, in the dominant methodology. And then, of course, this other subset or less is done before, during, or after you have done the dominant, conducted the dominant one. And then this is followed up with interpretation. You also have transformative, which is more related or more similar to explanatory sequential, but the difference here is that with transformative design, the focus is on participatory. It is inclusive. It is advocacy, and it focuses on using findings or processes to bring about transformation in form of social justice and so on. So you want to focus on bringing change through the process of your study. And then you have multi-phase, whereby you have different studies, and in each of the study you have a different approach, which is could be qualitative or quantitative, and then followed up by another study which has a different approach, and then it could be followed up with a mixed method study. So basically, these are the three designs. These are the three main approaches, and with their respective designs. So when choosing an approach or design, you have to consider the research paradigm that you want your study to focus on. It will also depend, the choice will also depend on the purpose for that, for why you're collecting data, or why you want to use, what you want to use the data for. And then also it could depend on the data that is needed. Is the data, do you need just numbers, data in form of numbers? Do you need data in form of words? Or you need data that combines both quantitative and qualitative? But it also depends on the issue that is under study, whether the issue has been studied before, or whether it is not known in details. So it depends on what you want to study. So for instance, if you are studying, if you want to study, let's say, domestic violence in a certain village where domestic violence has never happened, and so on. And that is a sensitive issue. Perhaps one may need to choose qualitative first to understand why things are happening, and later on generalize. Or the choice may depend on duration in terms of time and frequency. So it could be cross-sectional, which is one time study, or longitudinal studies, where you have, for instance, panel or cohort studies. Okay, or the choice can be influenced by resources, or in terms of budget and time. So, say if you have limited budget and time, you may not want to go for a mixed methods design, because mixed method design would require more expertise, more resources in terms of time and budget. Uh, but of course, most importantly, the choice of design and approach will also depend on the characteristics of the study unit of analysis, which we refer to as the study population. So, a study population in here, we do not mean people as people themselves or only. We mean anything that you want to use as a sample, or you want to use as um, uh, you want to use for the study. So it's not only people, it could be organizations, it could be interventions as a unit, and so on. So what the study preparation and sampling, when you're sure about the research paradigm you want your research to take, when you're sure about your design and approach, and when you're sure about the methods you want to use, then the next focus is on the study population. So population means the universe of units, or the total number of units from which you sample those that you will involve in your study. And in this case, the sample equals the units of the population that you have selected for your study, the units that you have selected from the total population. So samples may be selected randomly, which is probability sampling, or non-randomly, which is non-probability. So let's look at the difference between probability sampling and non-probability sampling. So under probability sampling, the selection is random, and therefore aiming to give each unit equal chance to be selected. And it is mostly used for quantitative studies, sorry, and it is objective in that case. The strength here is that it is best used for large population, and it enhances representativeness, accuracy. eh? So in this case, this at least the sample that you select uh, uh, represents in terms of characteristics the bigger population. That if you get findings, you could be able to generalize that if these samples are experiencing this particular event, then all other population with similar characteristics would experience the same. Okay, so in this case, it reduces bias and errors because you are not being judgmental in your selection, and you can statistically generalize the conclusions. The weakness here is that it may be difficult to locate samples for results verification or confirmation, for instance, since the population is large, the sample is large, and sometimes when you're doing survey, you have limited contact because you're not interacting with the sample. So there is, of course, while generalized conclusions are important for the larger population, they're also problematic because uh, uh, even if most of the larger population has similar characteristics, different individuals within that group of population um, have heterogeneous characteristics that sometimes define individual units. So when you generalize, you miss some subjective characteristics that independently belong to each of the units that are being analyzed. But you so on the other hand, you have non-probability sampling, which does not consider random selection. It is judgmental and it is subjective. So based on what the researcher wants to study, and mainly used for qualitative studies. Of course, uh, it's best used for small groups with similar characteristics within a certain context, and it is very simple to locate. It becomes simpler to locate samples to verify results or data if you have after you have for instance selected and collected data. But of course the strength is that the conclusions are context based, but of course, the problem is that you can only deal with small groups, and the other weakness is that there is some bias because some units are more likely to be selected than others. Take an example: if you are studying, for instance, uh, participation of villagers uh, on issues or within or in meetings that are aimed at, for instance, discussing how to improve water access and water source management. Um, could be that within that village, the most educated people will participate, or those that are within power positions will participate than those that are, for instance, not rich, uh, or not educated or do not have power. So there is some bias with the selection, and therefore the representation is not accurate. So that's why, of course, we are saying that it is context based. So probability type, there are of course different types of sampling under probability sampling. So you have simple random, which is complete random selection, whereby the researcher can use techniques like lottery. For instance, they get your units, write them on a paper, drop them in a bottle or in a jar or in a basket, shake them, and then you can just choose at random, and then you have your sample. But then you have systematic random, which uses a simple random technique to select the first number from a sampling frame. So a sampling from frame is a list with the total population or total population from within. which you have to select. So you use simple random sampling to select the first number, and then you use that number as the interval base to systematically select others. So in a list, for instance, if you have 1 to 100, you can simply at random select one number, um, let's say 3, and then that means that for you continuously select uh, uh, each number that comes up after you have counted 3. Okay, so but of course to get that interval, you first get the to get the total number of samples you want from the population. You have to first get the total number, and then divide by a certain sample that you want to draw, and then in that case you can have the interval that you want to use. Then you have stratified sampling, whereby the population is divided into mutually exclusive small groups, which are also known, referred to as strata in plural, or stratum in singular. And then you do random selection from each strata. Then you have cluster, whereby you have, let's say, within a country, you have a large number of population. Take an example, you want to study a certain teaching method within schools, and there are many schools scattered within a country or a certain region or a district. And then what you do, you divide these clusters, of course, having common characteristics, and then you randomly select clusters. And then for within each of those clusters, every unit within that cluster um, is selected for the study. You have random sampling types, and within these types, of course, you have different ways of selecting, but let's not forget that this is subjective, and you do not use random methods. So you have purposive, which is judgmental, but sometimes it is not considered as a subset, because generally non-probability sampling is considered as purposive. But just to be fair, yeah, this is sampling that is based on researcher's judgment. So it's up to the researcher to determine who can belong to the study. You have convenience sampling, which is also sometimes referred to accidental, because the sampling is based on availability or accessibility of individuals. So you get to a certain community or a certain organization, yeah, and there are people who are available uh, um, to participate in the research without you putting more efforts to struggle to look for those samples. There is voluntary sampling, which of course sometimes is also related to convenience, but here sampling is also related to on voluntary basis. So the reason why I'm saying that voluntary relates to convenience is because even voluntary basis is also depends on availability and accessibility. Then you have snowball sampling. In snowball sampling is where, for instance, it is difficult to you find difficulties to identify um, the respondents, and then you use the respondents to refer you to other respondents, since those respondents sometimes they can know each other. So take an example: you want to study about which doctors or traditional birth attendants. Um, these may know each other, and therefore when you select one respondent or one unit, then that respondent should be able can help you to refer to other respondents that may be difficult to find. You also have quota sampling, which sometimes they say it is more closely related to probability sampling, but it is usually categorized as non-probability, simply because yes, it is similar to stratified sampling, which belongs to probability sampling, but with quota there is no random uh, uh, application of sampling technique. Okay, so that's what makes it different from stratified sampling, and that's why it belongs to non-probability. So you, after deciding what categories you want to study, so those are quotas, it is up to the researcher to purposely select the units that would fit the category. So the researcher would judge in this case. So you have those key terms in terms of sampling, which you can also take a look at. Some we have looked at them, and these will discuss them more when it comes to issues to do with data collection and so on. Okay. So, so that's all for our discussion today. These are some of the resources you could find helpful to understand more about what we've discussed. Um, excuse me. Uh, for additional illustrated explanations on sampling, you could check Rahul Patwari, who really does a good job in illustrating how you could do the different sampling methods. Okay, thank you.